Track 8, Cross-Country Flight Planning. The examiner will now wrap up the discussion by looking at the specifics of the cross-country planning.
All right, Robin, let's take a closer look at your flight planning for today's cross-country. What information were you required to obtain to make this flight?
Since this flight will be out of an airport vicinity, the regs say I need to review weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, and consider available alternatives if my planned flight can't be completed. Also, I should be aware of any known ATC delays in effect, and last but not least, I should be familiar with runway lengths I'm going to use, as well as takeoff and landing distances for them.
What type of navigational charts are you going to be using today?
A sectional chart. I also have a VFR terminal area chart for Dallas-Fort Worth handy, and just in case I happen to need them, I have some of the adjacent VFR charts to our route of flight with me in my flight bag.
Now, just how often are these charts revised, and how do you know if they're current?
They're semi-annual, except for some areas outside the U.S. where they're revised annually. I look at the next edition schedule date on the chart cover to determine if it's still current.
Let's take a closer look at your flight log you prepared. Explain how you determined your initial compass heading for today's flight.
All right. The first thing I did was measure my true course on the chart with my plotter. Then, based on my weather briefing, I plugged the winds aloft direction and speed, along with my true course, into my flight computer to come up with my true heading as well as true airspeed. Then I found the magnetic variation off the chart and applied this value to come up with my magnetic heading. And finally, I applied the deviation off the compass card in the aircraft to arrive at my final compass heading.
Now, you've chosen 4,500 feet MSL as your en route altitude. Explain why.
Several reasons. The first one was the hemispheric rule that says when I'm operating above 3,000 feet AGL on a magnetic course of 180 to 359 degrees, I should fly at an even altitude plus 500 feet. Other considerations were wind direction and velocity up at altitude, as well as the height of terrain and obstructions along the route. I also considered the airplane's performance as well as possible turbulence at different altitudes.
So, Robin, how did you go about selecting the checkpoints you have in your flight log?
I try to use only the most prominent features I could find on the sectional. For example, my first two checkpoints are large lakes along my route of flight. Can't miss those. I also used a relatively large town and an interstate highway. To back up some of these checkpoints, I'll use VOR radials as a cross-reference.
How far apart are the checkpoints?
The first couple of checkpoints are only 10 miles apart. I don't want them too far apart to help me stay on course. At the same time, I want them far enough apart to allow for an accurate ground speed check. I shoot for checkpoints that are about 15 to 20 minutes apart flying time.
Speaking of ground speed checks, how are you going to calculate the actual en route ground speed and the ETA at your checkpoints and again at your destination?
I'll make note of the arrival time over a checkpoint and then do the same over the next checkpoint. I've already figured the distance between these, so all I'll need to complete the equation is the actual time between them. After I get an actual en route ground speed, I can then calculate my ETA over the next checkpoint and final destination.
Okay, let's talk about your fuel requirements for this trip. We've already talked about your fuel calculations, which were pretty darn good. What do the regulations have to say about the minimum fuel requirements for a VFR flight?
During the day, I need to have enough to fly to the first point of intended landing, and assuming normal cruise speed, fly after that for at least 30 minutes. At night, I need enough to fly to the first point of intended landing, and again, assuming normal cruise speed, fly after that for at least 45 minutes.
How will you file and activate for your flight plan today?
Well, I could file it in the air by radio, but it's best to file on the ground prior to departure with the local FSS or through DUATS on my computer. Once airborne, I'll contact the FSS by radio and give them my takeoff time so they can activate the plan. I'll close it after landing by telephoning the FSS serving Abilene.
Once we're airborne, what frequency are you going to use to activate your flight plan?
I'll use 122.6 to activate. The FSS in this area lists this frequency above a blue communications box on the chart. If in doubt, I'd ask the FSS for the appropriate frequency during my pre-flight briefing.
Could you use your cell phone to activate the flight plan?
No, the FCC doesn't allow the use of standard cell phones once in flight.
Let's take a look at the chart here. When you take off, what type of airspace are we going to be in?
Well, initially, we'll be in Class G airspace up to 700 feet AGL. Then we'll enter Class E airspace.
Now, how do you identify controlled and uncontrolled airspace on the chart?
Class E controlled airspace is designated with magenta and blue shading. Class G uncontrolled airspace isn't depicted by specific coloring. Basically, if it's not depicted as controlled airspace on the chart, then it's Class G, excluding Class A, of course.
Okay, tell me about this. Basic VFR weather minimums that are in controlled airspace.
For less than 10,000 feet MSL, I need 3 statute miles visibility and maintain cloud clearances of 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontal from clouds. At or above 10,000 feet MSL, I need 5 statute miles visibility and maintain cloud clearances of 1,000 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 1 statute mile horizontal from clouds.
Okay, how about uncontrolled airspace? What are the minimums there?
A little more complicated, but here we go. From the surface up to and including 1,200 feet, regardless of MSL altitude, I need 1 statute mile visibility and remain clear of clouds in the daytime. At night, I need 3 statute miles visibility and maintain cloud clearances of 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontal from clouds. The exception to this is when operating in an airport traffic pattern and within half mile of the runway. All I need then is 1 statute mile visibility and to remain clear of clouds.
Okay, let's talk about the different classes of airspace we're going to run across today. Will it be necessary to get Class B clearance?
No, the floor of the Class B airspace indicates 3,000 over Arlington and progressively gets higher as we proceed west, shown by solid blue lines with sectors and altitudes for each. My intention is to remain clear of Class B, and if necessary, I'll delay my climb to the final cruise altitude of 4,500 feet until over Lake Benbrook, where it indicates the floor is 5,000 feet.
Now, if you needed to get clearance into Class B airspace, just how to go about doing that?
I would contact approach control after finding the frequency and the legend of the sectional or on VFR terminal area charts. I'd tell them who I am, where I am, and what I want, and wait for their instructions and or clearance to enter.
How is Class C airspace depicted on the chart, and what are the requirements to operate in Class C airspace?
Class C airspace is shown by solid magenta lines, and just like Class B airspace, its vertical limits are given as two numbers, indicating the ceiling and floor of the airspace in hundreds of feet MSL. Each one can be configured differently, but generally the lateral dimensions are a 5 nautical miles radius core that extends from the surface up to 4,000 feet above the airport, a 10 nautical miles radius shelf that extends from 1,200 feet to 4,000 feet above the airport, and then an outer area with a radius of 20 nautical miles, like an upside-down wedding cake shape. There are no specific pilot certificate requirements, but it does require two-way radio communications, clearance before entering, plus my aircraft must be Mode C transponder equipped.
Okay, so how can you be certain that communications have been established when trying to obtain a clearance into Class B or Class C airspace?
If the controller responds to the initial radio call without using my IN number, then radio communications have not been established.
As usual, Robin, you're right. Now, workload permitting, the controller will indicate you should remain outside Class B or Class C airspace and stand by. So, moving on, show me an example of Class D airspace and what are the requirements to operate within it?
It's shown on this chart by a blue segmented or dashed line, like this one. Class D airspace is from the surface to 2,500 feet MSL surrounding airports that have an operating control tower. There are no specific pilot certification requirements, but you must have two-way communication capability and establish it prior to entry.
Now, Robin, do all Class D airspace areas have the same dimensions?
No, Class D airspace areas can be individually tailored. Like here, if you look at the chart, we can see the Class D airspace was made to contain the instrument approach procedure. Also, the vertical limit may be different, and this will be indicated on the chart.
One more question about Class D airspace for you. What's the maximum aircraft speed permitted in Class D?
200 knots.
Does ATC provide separation services if you're in Class D airspace?
Not for VFR aircraft. On a workload permitting basis, a controller may provide radar traffic advisories, safety alerts, etc., but I'm responsible to see and avoid other aircraft, terrain, or obstacles.
As usual, you're the perfect student. Now, it's a common misconception the tower will provide separation services if you're in Class D airspace, but it's definitely not part of their responsibility. It's yours. So, okay, when the tower closes for the day, what happens to the surrounding airspace?
It will revert to Class E or Class G airspace. You can look in the airport facility directory. It indicates effective times for Class D and what it becomes when the tower closes.
Speaking of Class E airspace, what is Class E surface area?
It is Class E airspace that, as the name implies, begins at the surface. When it acts as a surface area for an airport, it's configured to contain all instrument procedures for the airport.
Are there any communication requirements when operating within a Class E surface area extension?
No, the controlled airspace contains standard instrument procedures without imposing a communications requirement on pilots operating under VFR. When operating in this area, I must make sure that I meet the minimum cloud clearances for Class E airspace, but that's the only requirement.
Okay, what's the main difference between Class G airspace and the controlled classes?
The main difference is the flight visibility cloud clearance requirements to operate within it.
If VFR flight minimums can't be maintained, can a VFR flight be made into Class B, C, D, or even E airspace?
No, but with one exception, a special VFR clearance may be obtained, provided the flight can be made clear of clouds with at least one statute mile visibility.
Let's say you find you need to have one of those. What would you do to go about getting one?
I call the tower when one was located within the Class B, C, or D airspace. If dealing with a Class E surface area, I'd call the nearest tower, FSS, or Air Route Traffic Control Center.
How about at night? Are special VFR clearances still available?
Only for instrument-rated pilots flying an IFR-equipped airplane.
Okay, to finish up on airspace, we need to cover some special use airspace. Who would you contact for clearance into a prohibited, restricted, or warning area?
Well, I can't get a clearance into a prohibited area, so that's not even a possibility. This is one here with a solid blue line with blue hatched lines. To locate the controlling agency for a restricted or warning area, I'd go to the special use airspace section in the chart margin, locate the restricted area in question, and then make note of the location, altitude, times of use, and controlling agency, which is usually an Air Route Traffic Control Center. Center frequencies can be obtained from several sources, such as flight service, an AFD, or a low altitude and route chart.
Okay, Robin, what is the significance of alert areas?
The significance is that this airspace could contain a high volume of pilot training or an unusual type of aerial activity. No clearance is required for entry, although it's a good idea to contact the controlling agency on its status before entering it. Information on the alert area can be found on the chart margin. They're identified on the chart by solid blue line with blue hatched lines.
Let's talk about MOAs. What are they?
MOAs are established to separate certain military training activities from IFR traffic. VFR pilots should use extreme caution when flying with an MOA. The FSS can assist in determining the status of an MOA. They're shown on the chart by solid magenta line with magenta hatched lines.
What's the difference between an MOA and an MTR?
An MOA, or military operational area, is a general area, while an MTR, or military training route, is a route or corridor. You can see examples of MTRs just about everywhere on this chart. These are the gray lines with a route designator. These are routes military aircraft fly to conduct low-altitude, high-speed training.